everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the Family Business Alliance presentation of trends, surveys, and current realities. We're here today with Patricia Saldano, Josh Barron, and Judy Lynn Walsh. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. We're scheduled for an hour and a half today, which includes Q&A. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A feature. Participants will upon entry, and this session is being recorded and will be emailed to you along with the slide deck to whatever email address you use to register. If you are posting anything on social media, we encourage you to use the hashtag FBA Alliance. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Executive Director of the Smith Family Business Initiative at Cornell University, Dan Vandervliet.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin, and hello to all the members of the Family Business Alliance, as well as our invited guests. Just a few words about the Family Business Alliance. This is an association of family business directors, assistant directors, and program coordinators. It was founded in 2003 as an effort to bring together peers to help us better serve the members of our family businesses that we associate with in various places. It has grown to include approximately 75 centers throughout North America, including Canada. Some of these centers are now non-affiliated with universities and are standalone nonprofits, but we all have one common goal, and that is to help better serve our family business members. We typically meet each year in person. This year, we were scheduled to be in Toronto this week. As you know, travel has been restricted, but we decided to forge on and still hold our conference virtually. So for all of you that are joining us, welcome to the first virtual Family Business Alliance Directors meeting. And we have a great mix of folks who are listening today. So we're pretty happy. This is our first attempt at really broadcasting something to all of our members, and we're glad that so many of you responded. We hope to be back in Toronto next year in 2021, and hopefully things can begin to start moving along a little bit more like we are accustomed to. Just a brief word on the agenda for today. Once we kick off, as Erin mentioned, we're scheduled for about 90 minutes today. We'll try to stick to our schedule as best as possible. We'll invite Pat Saldano in first to talk about the Family Enterprise USA 2020 Annual Owners Survey. As she runs through her slides, she has about 20 minutes to do so, and then we'll do some question and answer specifically about that owner survey after she completes. Again, submit any of those questions via chat, and Erin will introduce those at that time. We'll then turn it over to Judy Lynn Walsh and Josh Barron of Banyan Global to talk about a more recent survey that has been launched in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So it's a little more timely in regards to how family businesses are responding to the current crisis, and as well as some ideas and tips for moving forward. They too will have about 20 minutes to complete the findings of their survey, and then we'll open it up to questions for them. As time permits, we'll and aim to conclude by about 2:30. I want to start and introduce Pat Saldano. She has spent over 25 years managing family offices and providing full-service integrated family office services to many families. She is currently president of Family Enterprise USA, and she will explain what that is in a little more detail. But generally speaking, they are an advocate for family business at a national level. She has partnered with the Family Business Alliance over the years to help administer the Family Enterprise USA Business Owner Survey, and she has quite a few years of data that she has collected, and this is the most recent update, which will probably also prove to be one of the most interesting given the current times. Josh Barron is co-founder and partner at Banyan Global. For the last decade, he's worked closely with companies who own assets together, such as operating companies, family foundations, and family offices. And he is joined by his colleague, Judy Lynn Walsh, who is a principal at Banyan Global, specializing in business strategy, family strategic planning and governance, and wealth management. We're going to start with Pat Saldano of Family Enterprise USA, and then we'll hear from Josh and Judy later. So at this point, I want to invite Pat to come on and share the results of the 2020 Family Enterprise USA Business Survey. Pat, how are you today? You're still on mute, Pat.
Thanks, Dan. Sorry, I was still on mute.
There we go.
Appreciate the opportunity to share the survey with all of you today and have a chance to speak with you. So thanks very much for the invitation. So Family Enterprise USA is, as Dan already mentioned, it is a national organization. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C. We are supported solely by family businesses. We are an advocacy organization. While we are not a family business center, we do not do what you all do. So I think it's important that you understand that we are not competing with family business centers. And in fact, we need, as many of you know, your support in order to do what we need to do to advocate for family businesses all over the United States and with legislators in DC. So we do use the family business centers to distribute the survey questionnaire, and we're very, very appreciative of everyone distributing it to their members. So if you want to move to the next slide, and I am actually trying to get up my slide so I can see this a little better. So here we go. Yeah. So in terms of the survey and the participants, it was conducted in January, end of January to April 24th. As you can see, 179 respondents, which was less than last year. Disappointed that we didn't get as many, but in light of the fact that this was being done through the COVID-19 pandemic, we expected to have not as good a turnout as we had in prior years. We're going to pass the next slide and move on to slide 8. And this is the slide that talks about the various industries who responded. As you can see, manufacturing at the top at 14%, real estate 13%, construction machinery, food and beverage, and agriculture at 6%. So most people believe that family farms is the most predominant family business in America, and that has declined over the years. And so even though they're very, very important to the country and very important to legislators, they don't represent as big of a part of the family business population as they used to. In terms of the number of employees, the respondents to this survey, which is typical for other years, is they tend to be on the large size of family businesses. So 74% of the businesses that responded have 50 or more employees, and 58% have 100 or more employees. So you can move on to the next slide. This is a question that we've never asked before, and I wish we had, so we had some background. But 84% of our family businesses that respond are in business for more than 30 years. I wish we added 50 years or more, because I suspect we would have gotten a very large percent also. What's important about this is we can tell legislators that family businesses families see their business as a legacy. And this proves it. They build their businesses for their employees and for their families and for their community. And so they look at their business different than non-family businesses. And you can move on to the next slide. We're going to skip this one and move on to the revenue and growth. So we should be on slide 9. In terms of revenue and growth for 2019, 65% of those have 21 million or more in revenue. And in fact, 74% have over 11 million in revenue. So once again, these businesses tend to be on the larger side. In terms of how they've grown their business and how they expect to grow their business, 80% of them believe that they grew through their strategic choices, not a surprise, and 60% economic conditions. We can move on to the next slide. In terms of their expectations for next year, those expectations even higher in terms of the size of the business. 68% have over 21 million, 76% 11 million. In terms of their confidence for growing their business, 26% say they're very confident to grow their business. And once again, they believe that growth is going to be achieved through the strategic decisions they make. But if you look at the bottom right-hand side of that slide, you will see that 16% don't think they're going to grow their business. And most of that we attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm kind of surprised actually that number wasn't larger, but family businesses tend to be more optimistic and confident. I just emailed with one this morning who said their business declined 25% and they're already back up to last year's revenue today. So that's encouraging. We're going to move on to slide 12. This is who responds to the survey. Not only do the businesses tend to be medium to larger size businesses, they are the majority, or they are senior management in the company. So 77% are presidents or senior executive or board chair. Next slide, we asked, well, where is the ownership of the business currently? And 29% is in G1, 41% G2, 45% in G3, and 29% in G4, which is very encouraging because we like to see the ownership of the business grow with the business. And 88%, as you can see on the bottom part of the slide, believe, as I mentioned earlier, that their business is truly a legacy. In terms of the management, it's actually even higher. G2, 47% of the G2 are managing the business or in management in the business, and 49% G3 and 27% G4. So 1/3 of these participants have in fact defied the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves parable. Moving on to the next slide. What is interesting is while 88% of them see their business as a legacy, 53% have not passed the business on to the next generation. And the reasons for that, as many of you probably know, working with family businesses, it's very hard for first generation or entrepreneurs to let that business go. So they don't believe the next generation's ready, or it's the business isn't ready. It's not the time. And some of it is the entrepreneur just doesn't think they're ready. In terms of those that have passed on, 65% partial ownership, 53% non-controlling ownership, only 22% controlling, and 18% full ownership. Again, for those very same reasons. Next slide. What strategy have they used? Probably not a surprise to most of you that gifting is the #1 strategy that families use to pass the business on. So then again, we asked, do you believe that sustainability of the business is dependent upon the ownership moving to the next generation? And 89% say yes. Amazing when you think that 53% say, well, I haven't done it yet, but 89% believe that it's something they need to do. So let's move on to slide 17. And this talks about the revenue growth in 19 and 18. 79% grew in 19. It's 81% in 18, so a little less, and you'll see that again if we move to the next slides. In terms of their confidence, 26% said they're very confident, as I mentioned earlier, about their ability to grow the business, but this is down from 33% last year. And in terms of those businesses that have grown over 10%, which is on the right side of the screen, you will see that 39% grew their businesses more than 10%, but that's down from 47% in 2018, so an 8% decline. Next screen talks about what is the top risk as they see it, and they see it as the market recession or the market turndown. But if you look at the bottom, you will see other risks, and those other risks, of course, include the coronavirus. I suspect that some of the coronavirus impact or effect is also reflected in that 58% as well. Let's move on to the next screen, which talks about their greatest impediment to growth. Once again, it's market conditions and other things were mentioned, were labor shortages, rising costs, and coronavirus. And we're not going to go through it today, but we have some really great quotes from family business owners in this slide deck that you'll all receive. And they talk about this in much more detail. And I should have mentioned this earlier. We actually, as I think all of you know, we have no ability to know who responds to the survey. We get no contact information or no ability to communicate with them unless they provide that in the summary, in the survey form itself. I wish that more of them would do that because we have some great quotes that they've given us, but we don't know who they're coming from. So we have a few, less than a dozen, that have actually provided their contact information. But once again, you distribute, the centers distribute the survey. Family Office Exchange distributes it to their members as well. It is all confidential. They don't even know who responds to the survey. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. When we ask them their top tax concern. Now in this slide, in this question, I should say, we asked, which is your top tax concern? They had to rate it 1 through 7. And so at the top of the list is income taxes. And I believe this is because family businesses continue to pay at income tax rates as individuals, because as most of you know, they operate through pass-through entities. So S Corps, LCs, LLPs, unlike C corporations who now get to pay a 21% tax, family businesses are still paying at income tax rates. This is why it's so important for their voices to be heard, because in my opinion, the 2017 Tax Act really threw family business under the bus. The pass-through legislation that they received was minimal at best. So we need to fight harder for family businesses so they get the same benefits as the C Corps. Next on their list of tax concerns is estate taxes, capital gains, payroll taxes, and as you can see, energy taxes at the bottom of the list. Next slide talks about their economic concerns. In this case, they were given the opportunity to rate all of these economic policies so they could rate one more than once. And so interesting that at the top of this list is the estate tax, and second is income tax, and then reducing regulation. Over the years, we have found these three to kind of flip back and forth. Last year, reducing regulation was at the top, but they're very close. So it's helpful for us to know what their concerns are. So when we meet with legislators, we can explain what they are. And the fact that trade policies is at the bottom of the list suggests while it's important, it's not as important as these other economic issues for family businesses. And that's what legislators need to hear. In terms of the estate tax, well, we asked them, well, if you had a choice, what would you do? Would you repeal it or reduce the rate or make the exemption permanent? And interesting that they actually would like the rate reduced to that of capital gains as opposed to repeal. I suspect that's because that's realistic. Repeal is not a realistic option in today's political and economic environment. And then obviously making the exemption permanent is very important for businesses as well. I'm not going to spend much time on this because it's a very small universe of who answered the question. It's only 16, 18 of the members, but it's helpful for us to know what kind of jobs they're lost or they don't hire. In this case, 288 on an annual basis due to the planning or the cost of the estate tax. Again, 1.1 million in life insurance premiums and 310,000 in lawyers and accountants. I suspect, again, this is the very large business owners because those are very big numbers. Let's move on to the next slide. This is some of the quotes we're not going to spend time on today. So let's move on to page 27. This is, again, the first time we've asked this question because anecdotally, we always thought that family businesses pay more and provide better benefits. And in fact, 56% of them pay better benefits and better salaries than their competition, their non-family business competition, and 40% pay on average as their competition. Next slide. Again, some more quotes, and I'm moving on to slide 30 now, which is the last slide. Again, anecdotally, we always believe that families contribute locally. They support their community, and this shows that 77% of them give locally and they give 23% nationally. Why this is important, and I will say last year this was 79%, so this isn't an aberration. While it's important is because when family businesses have to be sold for whatever reason, due to the pandemic, due to the estate tax, due to income taxes, the community suffers dramatically. The community in terms of the charitable community and also in terms of jobs, as well as, of course, the family business. So that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Pat. For those that are listening in and you have questions, please feel free to submit them via the chat. Would certainly love to include that. Sorry about that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the current status of the survey? Is it still open? Can people still respond?
It is not open. We closed it at the end of April. We need to do that because we need to report those results to legislators, and I have Zoom and conference calls meetings scheduled the week of June 6th with legislators because they want this information. So if we kept it open forever, we wouldn't be able to give them that. So it is closed. We are going to be doing things differently this year because we have really ramped up the organization, and we're going to be doing small surveys, 3 to 5 question surveys that we're going to be sending out to our members and other family businesses that we've connected with throughout the nation.
Okay. And I'm curious, you did show some sort of longitudinal data from 2018 to 2019, but you've been conducting this survey since, I think, 2013. Over that time, are there several key takeaways, or have there been some constants in terms of the outlook for family business owners?
Yeah, we've been actually conducting this since the late 2000s, but to your point, the consistency has been since about 2013. I think the takeaways are pretty similar. Family businesses tend to be more confident and more optimistic. They all do, as I mentioned, they plan their business as a legacy for their families and for their employees and for their community. And that's just a different mindset. We have found that they tend to care about tax policy because, as I mentioned, they pay as an individual. They are the only ones that pay estate tax. Corporations don't pay estate tax, only individuals and families pay estate tax. So their concerns are not different. Regulation continues to get worse and worse and worse, especially since 2008. So I think that is, always at the top of the list in terms of their concerns every single year.
Great. I'm going to turn it back to Erin here for a moment and just see, I think we've received some questions from our participants, and let's see where those lead us. Erin?
Sure. So one question that we've had is it possible to break out the response data by date, and has it been compared at all to how it relates to the COVID pandemic as it's unfolded over the course of time since it was done from January to April?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been asked that before, actually. We do have the response data by week. And I will tell you that it aired on the side of the earlier part of the survey. The longer the survey goes on, typically we'll get a rush at one point when someone sends it out. Ed Hart has been wonderful in terms of sending the survey out over and over again, and we probably got more responses from Cal State Fullerton than I think any other school. So, but in most of the responses, I would say at least a third come within the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then it's spread out over. So at that point, the pandemic wasn't as hard hit as maybe the middle of the survey and toward the end of the survey, which ended at the end of April.
Has there been any thought to doing some sort of follow-up? I know this is an annual survey, but given the unique environment that we find ourselves in globally, has there been any thought to kind of doing something now post unfolding to see how things have changed potentially?
Yes, absolutely. So that's one of we're calling it a mini survey that we're going to be sending out post-COVID. We're trying to figure out the best timing. We think it'll be in the month of June with maybe 5 questions. We're trying to get it down to 3, but it's going to be difficult. So if the family business centers are interested in helping us with that, we would really welcome that. We want to get it to as many family businesses as possible. We also are collecting family business stories. So we're just starting to put them on our website. If there are family businesses that have, and most of them have done great work in their community, whether it's collecting masks or handing out meals, we are putting those on our website and we're presenting those to legislators. So once again, they can see not only do they employ people and drive the business, but they also are very involved in their community and the good work that they do.
Wonderful. And are you aware of any surveys, similar surveys being done for Canadian family business markets as they relate to Canadian tax questions?
I'm not specific to Canada. There are organizations that do international surveys, and we are not international. We're just US. So, but there's other surveys out there, and there's other organizations that do annual surveys. I think where there's some overlap in some of our questions, I think we tend to be more focused on what's important in the United States.
Great. And so we also had another question about if there is any thought to doing more in-depth questioning about the passing of businesses between generations and whether or not it's been explored further, that perhaps the current generation isn't ready. So kind of gauging what the reasoning is behind why it hasn't been passed on yet, given obviously the importance that the survey signifies.
Well, throughout my decades of career, I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs, and that's why I'm running Family Enterprise USA. I've worked with many, many family businesses. I love family businesses. I think they're so important to America. So what I have found over and over again is what the data shows, which is entrepreneurs, especially the founders, are always so very reluctant to let go. I have as Ed knows, I facilitate a women CEO group, and we have a woman in the group who's 84 years old who really cannot give up the ownership for, her son is running the business every day and he's doing a wonderful job. But she just says, well, I don't know what I'm going to do every day if I don't come in the office. And that's a real issue for people. I mean, it sounds really silly, but it is. And then the other is the succession. How do I handle that? I mean, that's why succession is at the top of the list for all of you family business centers, and you do so many great events around this. It's such an important topic. They don't know how to do it. They don't know from a legal aspect, ownership, how do you pass that? And then from the management, who should be the manager? How should I do it? Is it my son? Is it my daughter-in-law? Who's best qualified? And they get themselves caught up in the nuances as opposed to just focusing on what's the ultimate goal, in my opinion. It's very hard because of the family dynamics. It's the biggest issue I think that family businesses face.
Sure. So along those lines, with your organization, can you talk a little bit more about your focus areas and maybe how much of your focus relates to estate taxes and changing, repealing, modifying those legislations?
Yeah, estate taxes is important only because families and family businesses are the only ones that pay estate tax. But it's, as you saw, it's not the most important. Income tax is probably now more important because family businesses are still paying 30 to 35% and corporate America is paying 21%. So, and other taxes as well. So taxes and government regulation are really at the top of the list. The only reason that estate tax is singled out is because, again, families and family businesses pay that. So we spend an equal amount of time. So in my meetings with members of Congress and staff, I go through, I can't go through the whole deck because, as most of you know, if you've met with members, you're lucky to get 15 minutes. So I'm very selective based on the member I'm talking to, what slides I use and what slides I don't use. But I always use the 2 slides that focus on what their tax priorities are and what their economic priorities are. That's what legislators want to know. And I focus on the slides that show family businesses see their business as a legacy, how important it is to them, and how many of their children are actually working and own the business.
Great. And so was there anything that came out of the data for this survey that you found surprising or unprecedented?
No, other than I expected the pandemic to have a bigger influence, and maybe because we were doing it at the beginning as opposed to the end, it didn't have as big of impact as I would have thought. And also I think because, once again, family businesses just seem to thrive and they seem to just get through it and have an optimistic attitude about their businesses. And so there was no revelation. The questions around the benefits and salary was very helpful for me because I always thought that was the case, but now I have something to actually share with legislators. And the length of the ownership of the family businesses, again, 84% of them are over 30 years old. That's very powerful information to present to legislators because what they want is this country to survive and to add jobs. And that's what family businesses do.
Great. And so we touched on this a little bit earlier, but can you talk to a little bit about what the biggest difference in responses were from kind of the beginning of the onset of the pandemic and then towards the end of the survey, what you saw the most shift in?
Yeah, I can't tell you that because while we know the number that responded in a certain week, I don't know the exact question by question. So I haven't really done that deep dive analysis. We actually just finished this less than 2 weeks ago. So it's, you know, we haven't done that.
Great, thank you. And so we have one more question, which is obviously very timely and relevant. Do you talk to your participants at all, and are you finding any concern that they're looking to ensure sufficient diversity within their family businesses?
Yeah, so once again, I wish we could, but we don't get an opportunity to talk to our respondents because we don't know who they are. I have probably a list of maybe 10 to 12 that have actually given me their contact information, and I will call all of them. And because I have questions around the comments that they've made, but diversity is not a question that we have asked or that we have addressed. Maybe it's something we should think about, but it's just never been part of the question that we focused on.
Thanks so much, Pat, for answering our attendees' questions. I think we're good, Dan, to move forward.
Well, once again, thank you all. I appreciate your time and having the opportunity to speak to you.
Thanks, Pat. So we'll move into and bring Josh and Judy on here. If you give me a moment here, I'll share my screen again. And if we do this right, we should be in good shape. Okay, so I think Pat is going to stay on the line, and we have some more questions for her towards the end, but I want to turn it over to Josh Barron and Judy Lynn Walsh of Banyan Global, a family business advisory firm based in Boston, but they do business globally, as their name suggests. They launched a survey in the last few months as COVID-19 began to take on increased importance and seriousness, you know, really just trying to get the current pulse of business owners. So they're going to share the results of their survey. I believe Josh is going to share the results, and Judy is going to come in from time to time with various vignettes in terms of, you know, where they see some of this playing out. So, Josh?
Great. Thank you so much, Dan, and your team, Ed, as well, for giving us this opportunity to be with you. So we really appreciate the chance to share our work, to hear what's going on in all of your lives as well. As Dan said, we're not a survey research firm. We're an advisory firm that works with family businesses all over the world, and mostly on issues of generational transition and other big changes that they're facing. And what we know from our work with family businesses is that this can be a very isolating experience. You know, it's lonely at the top. It's difficult and challenging to be part of a family business in general. And when you layer on to that, the frightening aspect that came with all the uncertainty around COVID, the immediate effect on family businesses, safety of their employees, their revenues, everything seemed just in flux. We asked ourselves, is there a way that we can be helpful? And most directly, of course, we've been working with our clients in their responses to family businesses, but also wanted to see if there was some way that we could even a little bit be helpful to this sector that we all very much believe in and have devoted our careers to. And that's really the genesis of this project. So what we'd like to do today is to, you can put to the next slide, Dan. And if there's some way to get it in presentation mode, it might be easier for folks to see the fuller screen. But okay, so what we want to do is we will share some of the results of a survey we've conducted. Also kind of layering that into what I'll call playbook for how the kind of questions that family businesses should be asking themselves as you're responding to the crisis. And then spend at least a little bit of time about how family businesses are thinking about the future. And this will, I think will pop up back up in a second. Just a couple references that we'll kind of refer to today. One is a survey report about the family business response to the pandemic. The other thing we'll sort of share some of the results from is, or some of the insights from is what we call the crisis playbook for family businesses, which is an article that we published in Harvard Business Review. And Dan, you can go to the next page. And both of those are available on our website, or feel free to contact us. So on the next page, you'll see just a quick overview of the survey results. We had around 190 responses from 20 countries came from 6 continents, no family businesses in Antarctica, but everywhere else, around 25 industries. And you'll see that there's a split basically between the revenue, there we go. The revenue of the respondents was split about evenly between businesses that were under 100 million in annual revenue and over 100 million in revenue. And you also see a split, not that different from the one that Pat was showing in her survey. We've got a cluster of first generation, second, third, and then some of the businesses that are fourth generation and beyond. So on the next page, one of the things we just wanted to do was a pulse check. How are you doing? How is this affecting you? And we asked them sort of how respondents are holding up, both in the business itself and then the family relationships and dynamics. I would say, and this was not surprising, but almost 90% of the respondents were having a negative impact from the crisis. I think the good kernel of news in there is that 5% of those were in danger of failing. The others were significant, but they didn't feel existential to them. There are a relatively small number that haven't been affected, and then there's about 5% that have actually seen a positive impact. And we actually work with some of these companies, whether they're grocery stores that certainly are dealing with the disruption of supply chains and new business practice, but their sales are up. We also work with a canned food company that sells mainly to consumers, and it's a great time to be in that business right now. So, but most of the businesses are really having a negative impact. Again, not surprising, but hopefully gives, if this is your position, hopefully at least know that you're not alone. On the next slide, we also asked how people are, what has been the impact on family relationships. And here you can see it roughly divided into thirds between those that have seen a negative impact, where perhaps this has exacerbated some pre-existing tensions, the need to make a lot of decisions very rapidly, especially ones that feel very big decisions that touch on major values. Some that have seen no impact at all on the relationships, things more or less as they were before. And then some actually that have seen a positive impact, that they're coming together, especially around this shared purpose of survival, of making it through. It's been a galvanizing force to both a lot of the respondents and to some of the family businesses that we're working with in the field. On the next page, I just want to introduce a quick framework. This is going to be sort of the heart of a book that we have coming out in January through Harvard Business Review, that's sort of intended to be a handbook for how to build and sustain a family enterprise that lasts across generations. The core idea of it is about the power of ownership. Ownership is not something that is talked about that much in business. I teach at a business school. We don't really teach much about ownership, except if it's about private equity or family businesses, because most of the way we tend to think about business is through the lens of a public model, where the owners are people that can buy and sell shares. They maybe send a proxy statement, but otherwise most of the power is in the managers of the business. And that's very different in a family business. And what we'll talk about is that there are 5 core rights that, as an owner of a business, that you have and that you can have, and that those things affect almost everything of importance about a family business. And really how you exercise those rights really affects whether or not your business can last or into the future, or whether it won't. And in a crisis, that becomes even more important, because there's choices that you've made, both explicitly and implicitly, some of which need to be revisited or reaffirmed in order to be able to give those that are running the business during this period the tools that they need to be able to navigate through it. So what we'll do is just spend a couple minutes on each of these 5 rights, working sort of in a clockwise fashion, starting with design. For each of them, I'll share some of the highlights from the survey, and then my colleague Judy will give a quick story about kind of what we're seeing in the real world with family businesses and how they're responding to this. So let's start with the right to design, which is basically the idea that as a family business ownership group, you get to choose, what do you own together? Is it an operating company or multiple operating companies, foundation, family office? You get to choose like who can be an owner. Is it just those that are working in the business, or all the descendants? And do you share control evenly, or do you divide it up? And on the next slide, Dan, please. What we're finding is that in this realm, at least so far, there hasn't been a lot of change. So you'll see that about 17% of respondents are actually looking to change their portfolio, mainly by acquiring. Not many are actually changing who can be an owner by bringing in new equity capital out from the outside. I think the lesson so far is that for a subset of businesses that are in a strong cash position, they're actually looking forward, and they're saying, you know, there are opportunities to acquire, to diversify, to expand after this crisis, and they're starting to get themselves ready to move into that mode. For those where it's more of an existential crisis, it's a really important time to revisit the question of, as one said, why are you in business together? Do you still want to be in a post-crisis world? And answering that in the affirmative should give you a very positive sense of momentum forward. If it's not clear that you want to, this is a good time to really rethink what are the full range of options. So Judy, can you share an example from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Josh. And I think there's another group too that where the timing just is a bit unfortunate. We kind of got caught up in, with COVID and whatnot. So one G3 manufacturing family business that Josh and I actually work closely with, we had 4 sibling shareholders. They were actually planning on selling their main operating business before COVID struck. So this had been in the works in 2019. And that was really just because they wanted to diversify their holdings. They didn't want to be as tightly bound together as they were just through board meetings and shareholder meetings. And given COVID, it happened right in the middle of their sales process. So they really had to put pause on that whole process with their investment bank and just reevaluate their whole timing and strategy. So now the question that they're facing is, how do they proceed? Do they try to resume the sales process as soon as it's reasonable and continue to position the company for sale, even if there's a discount compared to the pre-COVID values that they were looking at? Or do they really commit to, we're going to be family owners until the business regains its footing, and knowing that it could be 2 or 3 years before it actually is able to reach its prior performance levels? Can we commit to that amongst the 4 of us? And then the other question for them is really, do we just revert back to our previous position, which was, we're going to hold this business for the long term and continue to be the family owners of it and continue to pass it on to subsequent generations? So here it's a little bit challenging because, as you can imagine, amongst the 4 shareholders, there's differences in perspective, some who are more interested in getting out sooner and others later. So then there's the other option that's on the table, which is, for those who are interested and able to hang out longer, could they buy out other siblings, or, become a majority shareholder or whatnot? So there's lots of options and decisions in there, and it just requires a lot of really rich, robust, honest conversation amongst them.
Thanks, Judy. So let's go to the second right of family owners. So the next slide is about to decide. If you own a business, you have the right to make basically every decision, just about, whether everything from what markets you enter to the color scheme on the walls. And doesn't mean that you should do that. As the business grows, it becomes really important to think about how you make those decisions together, delegating appropriately to boards and executives and so on, the work of governance. And so we really wanted to know, how is this crisis affecting the way that family businesses are making decisions? And one question we ask is, what is the role of the owners in the crisis? And what we found is almost 50% of them, the owners have become more involved in the business. Another big chunk have not changed at all. And then there's a smaller percentage that have become less involved. But you can see through the comments, and these all should note that these things in quotes come directly from the survey respondents. People are saying a higher involvement by the owners, even in things that previously had been routine decisions, now actually are becoming really important. And so it's important to define what is the scope of decision making for the owners. Some more focus on command and control. Some are creating committees to handle the situations and just basically focused on this. Some are creating teams focused on the more immediate crisis, health and safety issues, revenue issues. Others focused on the future and how do we respond, make the recovery more V-shaped than U-shaped, as one put it. Providing more direction on certain things, and otherwise they might not participate in. And lastly, it's really become even more so about speed. I think the timing and importance of being agile has been increasing over the years. This puts another premium on the importance of being able to make even big decisions relatively quickly. Judy?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I mean, really to layer on, what we're really seeing is for most of our clients, they're not drastically changing the structures in which they use to make decisions, whether that's shareholder council, board of directors, family council, et cetera. But they might be using these forums more given COVID and in light of everything going on right now. So really, particularly at the shareholder level, they're putting really big ownership questions on the table, such as should we stay in business together or sell, or what are our dividend expectations, or what kind of guidance do we give to the board? So really big decisions are coming up that maybe haven't been evaluated as frequently in the past.
Good, and that gets into the next kind of main topic, which is the right to value. And as an owner of a business, you get to decide what success means for it. If it's a public company, we all know how success is about maximizing shareholder returns. As a family business, especially as if you're a private company, of course you need to perform financially or you won't be around for very long, but there might be other things that are also of value to you. And this, I think, life is always about trade-offs. Running a business is always about making choices between different things that are important to you. I think this crisis is really putting some of those things that may have been sacred before onto the table, at least for discussion. And so one of the questions we asked is, what trade-offs people are making to survive? And you'll see this list, and people could choose more than one response to this. So that's why you see greater than 100%. The most common thing people were doing was delaying capital expenditure. Next were things like reducing salary, reducing dividends. Very few were thinking of selling part of the business. So at least at the point that we were surveying people, which was really in the April to early May was really the cutoff for our survey, not sort of mostly thinking about these big existential questions, but more how do we get ourselves through it? And I think one of the things that's really come to the forefront in this crisis is the importance of cash, of your ability. I mean, businesses don't go out of business because they don't have customers. They go out of business in the short run because they can't pay their bills. And so what we found is that 90%, if you look across these, of respondents are using at least one of those tools above to conserve cash, whether they're reducing expenses, delaying CapEx, or reducing dividends. Almost 25% are using all three. And a good chunk are actually bringing new debt or equity into the company to be able to bridge this, including some that are pretty debt averse in general. They're needing to recapitalize the business to make it through this time period. And I think the note that one respondent says, cash is king. It's good to, you want to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. On the next page, the other sort of question of value is, what are the values that you're maintaining? And we ask people about the kinds of things they're doing that reflect their values. And one of the reasons why Judy and I love working with family businesses so much is because they are values-based businesses. They care more about their people, the communities, and so on, which I think also came through in Pat's survey. But we saw people talking about the things that they're doing, about drastic safety measures to prevent contamination, cutting back hours, people working from home. When they do have to lay people off, preparing for them to be able to be rehired, maintaining, even increasing donations and collaborating, using their resources as best as they can to help the community. Judy, for an example?
Yeah, just to illustrate, another family business we work with is a G2 chemical engineering business, and they've always had extremely strong values about taking care of their employees, because they believe that reflects on the health of the business. So they've always done profit sharing, basically just taking care of shareholders and employees in good years, in bad years. Everybody collectively tightens their belts. And right now what we're seeing is, true to their values, the shareholders are doing everything they can to make sure their employees are really as well positioned as possible to ride out all the uncertainty going on. So it would happen once, and something that the family will never forget. In the course of their over 50 years, they had to fire employees once, and they never ever want to do it again. That's the one thing that everybody says when they say, what keeps you up at night? It's the idea of letting people go in those families. So with COVID, their response has been to keep as much of their current workforce as possible on. And as the week stretched on, they've had to furlough some employees, but they made sure to let them know you have a job to come back to. And in the interim, we're going to cover health insurance for you and your families. So that's really in line with their values. They sacrifice shareholder dividends and short-term profitability just to make sure that their people and their business will be well positioned moving forward.
Great, thanks, Judy. The next slide, the fourth right of the owners is to inform. You basically have the control over what information is shared within the family, with employees, with the public, which provides a lot of ability to influence the communication and ability to create and sustain trusted relationships across the family business. And what we found here is that most of the folks that responded are communicating more frequently. We actually didn't ask about whether they were using virtual meetings. I wish we had directly, but a third, even without that prompt, said that we're using virtual meetings to stay in touch, and actually finding some good successes where they're able to, as people have gotten used to it, they're able to have more frequent communication, broader, including more of the family than maybe they had historically been able to do, especially those that are more widespread. And you can see again some of the examples: communicating more regularly with employees, having a weekly board call, more communication from the management to the family about what's going on, more virtual communication early and frequently. And I thought that it was interesting that one person said, honesty and transparency is really important, to be clear about what's going on. Because if you don't share what's going on in the business, people are likely to draw the worst case conclusion. Well, they're not talking about the future, we must be in jeopardy. So sometimes it's sharing just the perspective about how we are doing, and layering onto that the last comment, that doing that while maintaining a positive attitude. So you don't want to sort of say the sky is falling, be transparent, but also in a way that's generating enthusiasm and support. Judy?
Yeah, so to echo Josh, I think transparency is really important, and we've seen some of the families who've done it really well throughout all this have been very transparent with what's going on operationally and as well as financially, so that shareholders are well informed. So frequency shifting from quarterly in-person meetings to bi-weekly Zoom video conferences. I think that's kind of the beauty of Zoom, and they're doing other things just to make sure let's get the family council to increase their level of engagement and send out regular newsletters and just set up more conversations so that there's forums for people to talk through these things instead of being on your own island and wondering what's going on.
Thanks. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about the last right, which is if you own something, one of your rights is to sort of say, who gets it after us? How does it get past the next generation? And so, some of the themes we heard is, how is that being done in terms of a succession planning process? Are leaders staying longer or making way for the next generation? And there are some that are doing both. Some are saying, I wanted to retire, I was planning to, but I can't leave now. The business needs my leadership now more than ever. Others have said, look, this is a really important time to be focusing on business continuity and succession planning. It's easy to put it off and put it off and put it off, but this has really raised, in some sense, the importance of understanding the need to have the pipeline in place and to be making progress in the handoff and transition of leadership roles. Also asking people, are there opportunities, are they accelerating the transition of assets? Given lower valuations, it can be a very, a beneficial time to pass assets from one generation to the next. And we actually see a number of family businesses that are doing that. And then lastly, it's, how does this actually create a development opportunity for the next generation in particular? And I thought this quote was really telling. This is the second generation's first downturn. It's been mostly ups from here. It's a great learning experience for them. And I think we see that a lot in the family businesses that we're working with. This is a time for to take advantage of all the pain and suffering that's happening as an opportunity to really engage the next generation, help them learn what it's like to go through this, help them be prepared for the day when they'll have to do something similar. Judy?
Sure. Yeah, just to add to that. So with an example, one family we work with, it's a very international company. They have shareholders all across the globe. A really nice silver lining to all of this, which is, they're hard and few and far in between, is that a lot of the next generation family members who are still going through school, who are, starting their careers or have families, they now have a little bit more flexibility in their calendars. So they can participate in more virtual Zoom calls or owner education sessions. And it's a struggle for some more so than others, but generally possible to still find a handful of hours to connect virtually. So in some ways, it's actually really sped up their next generation development and really helped build their engagement as a group. Whereas, before they'd only see each other in person once or twice a year, and now they're able to have, weekly wine sessions or, connections over education. And that's not to say that it's just all about the next generation either, because we're also seeing that the current generation, there is a lot of responsibility on their shoulders too. And some of them have had to lean in more right now just because of all the issues that the business is confronted with. So, I don't know if it's really extended their natural ramp down of retirement targets very much so. If anything, I think we're seeing people say like, this would be a wonderful opportunity to get the business and the family over this really big challenge. And it could be a really nice swan song to go out on.
Thanks, Judy. And so just the next slide, kind of looking forward, I think one of the most challenging things about this for family business and all of us is just the uncertainty of the situation. Uncertainty is just something we don't deal with well as human beings. It makes planning very difficult. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that rather than trying to spend too much time mapping out what a future looks like, we're seeing family businesses have multiple futures or scenarios that they're working with. What's the most likely or most beneficial scenario? What's the most pessimistic? What's the one they think is the most likely to happen? And having plans to really navigate across those rather than trying to sort of get too much into the predictions game. We wanted to close just by on the next slide, just some advice, overall advice from the survey respondents. One of them is to don't forget the future. It's easy to get head down. It's important to make sure that you have a future, but also recognizing that there are choices you can make that will basically create the runway for what will happen over the next 3, 5, 10, 20 years of your family business, and keeping an eye on that. Making sure you live your values. This is a time to really focus in and making sure that you're demonstrating those through your actions, because people are paying attention. Remembering that this is a chance that will bring out not just your weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but also that this will show you your strengths and things that you can lean on. A lot of family businesses, over the time have been through lots of crises before, and there's a calming effect to know that we lasted through that. We will endure this as well. And then the last one is that just to be nimble. This is, things are moving, things are changing. It's a really important time to have some things that are inflexible on, but really bringing to your discussions a willingness to put things on the table, to have conversations, to consider things, and to do that quickly because things are changing so fast. With that, we'll just, on the last slide is just our contact information. If any of you would like to reach out, if you can't find the survey results or the article or anything else, we're always delighted to talk and have conversations. But other than that, we just want to thank you for this opportunity to share our work and look forward to hearing from you what's going on in your worlds.
Yes,
awesome.
you.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Judy. Yeah, we received some comments. Josh, it sounds like you've spoken at a few of the centers, and they highly recommend you in terms of your content and delivery. So thanks for sharing this with us today.
Much appreciated.
A couple questions. One, in regards to Banyan, first off, do you specialize in any industry segments, or is it fairly generic? And second, maybe touch on globally, are businesses responding differently globally based on either culture or where they are in the world?
Sure. So the first part's pretty easy. We don't specialize. We believe that of course there are industry dynamics, but that most of the issues are quite common across industries. And so we've worked with the full gamut of family businesses, over 200 in total across our firm. So, a whole range of businesses and industries. The question about globally is a really interesting one. I think that this is an experience that in sort of more ways than a lot of other crises, which people tend to experience all at the same time, at the same pace, it is so context dependent. I mean, we live in Massachusetts, which has been under effectively lockdown since really early days. Some of our clients in other parts of the country are sort of haven't even had this experience yet very much. Others are kind of coming out of it. And I think the same thing is true even more so at a global scale, where family businesses are just, they're at different moments. We actually have an office in Brazil, and Brazil was a little bit later to the coronavirus situation, but now it's hitting full force, and they're really sort of right in the middle of it. We've done a lot of work in Southeast Asia, and for a number of those countries, they're used to this. They went through the SARS epidemic very intensively. They wear masks as a matter of course. It's not really a debate anymore. And so they've really gone through their periods of recovery, businesses seeming much more usual. Now, of course, many businesses you cut across. So even if you're not where you are is mostly fine, your customers may be affected, your supply chains may be affected. So there clearly are sort of effects, effects across, but I do feel like this is something that people are experiencing differently around the world.
And, this is a tough question to ask, but I think it just reflects the seriousness of the nature. Any morbidity in the family business that you consult with? Have you seen any just, this is the end of the line. This is the last nail in the coffin?
Not yet, thankfully. I'm finding some wood to knock on as I say that. We have not in our group of family businesses, which admittedly tend to skew larger. We work with some of the probably 100 million plus in revenue businesses, many larger than that. We haven't seen any sort of existential threats. We've seen some that are really struggling and suffering. I think one of the things that family businesses, I think as Pat was saying, are quite resilient. One of the reasons why I think there has been this is because they tend to be, compared to other businesses, quite conservative, financially. Their balance sheets are very healthy, not a lot of debt, a lot more cash on hand. I was actually talking with a family business leader who went to a Harvard course about finance, and they basically spent most of the week telling him how he needed to borrow more money. And that was just sort of like, that is, if you take corporate finance, they will teach you the value of leverage. And I think that what we're experiencing in part in this crisis is the value of a healthy balance sheet, value of cash, the value of a business that can pay its bills and live to fight another day. And so I think that my guess, I haven't seen any analysis on this, it'd probably be hard to get. My guess is that family businesses have overall done better than other kinds in just terms of being able to weather the storm because of those attitudes and approaches compared to other kinds. But we fortunately haven't seen any of that in our client pool.
Interesting. Where have you seen just remarkable innovation, either in the way the family is communicating things they're doing to respond to this crisis, or how they are preparing for what it looks like when we come out of this?
I'll just give a couple examples, and Judy, feel free to add in. I think that this is a moment for innovation. I'm thinking of one family business leader. He runs a large company, and he said, "Look, our initial focus was on safety first. Our employees and so on need to be safe. Then we need to focus on stabilizing the business. The next thing we're going to focus on is, are there things that we should have been doing to increase our efficiency that we had been putting off? This is a really valuable time to maybe to get a little leaner, especially for companies that have been through a lot of growth." And then the last thing he says, what we're really focusing on now is, we can't control the pace of the virus. We can't control when the economy is going to reopen. What we can control is how ready we are to pounce when that does happen. And so they're really working on plans that would get them not just to sort of regain, but they think that they're in a position to outcompete the rest of the people in their sector, many of which are not family businesses. And so I think partly there's a mindset which keeps an eye on the day-to-day and the necessities and the crisis of this, but keeps the other eye on, like, how do we, if we're really committed to this for a generational time horizon, this is a blip. We need to really focus on how do we get ourselves out of it. So that's one example. I think we've also seen some examples of them just using their resources to benefit the communities, whether it's donations, volunteering's become more difficult. We have a few clients that have repurposed manufacturing lines to make masks and other things, which they were able to do, and have gotten some beneficial press, but also just a really good feeling. It really speaks to their values. Judy, anything else that you've seen?
Yeah, I would say that also just to build in, there are some who are, depending on the industry, you could have just gotten whacked really hard. And so, but the families that we've seen, one of which has multiple businesses, one which is in travel, which obviously was one of the really hard hit businesses, they're not giving up. If anything, they're saying, well, what can we do? How do we pivot our enterprise, our holdings? How do we, try to adapt and be nimble to all this so that we are addressing what travel looks like in the future? And it's not to say that they have all the answers just yet, but this is where there's a lot of opportunity when there's disruption to be really innovative. And family members who, small shareholder groups, they're really putting their thinking caps on and trying to get out ahead of it as much as they can.
And the last thing that I'll just sort of mention, I particularly enjoyed the slide about communication, and a lot of the students and business owners I've talked with, this has been almost a welcome outcome that not all meetings need to be in person. I was just speaking with one of our graduating students yesterday, and he's from a pretty significant agricultural family business. And this is an area where actually, they're able to have better meetings in some regards. First, because the family is distributed geographically, so it's much easier to, we can get together, 2 o'clock this afternoon for a meeting. We don't have to plan it months ahead of time. But at the same time, when they're sitting around the table, it's much different when you're talking to your father, your mother, or your sibling, and they're right across the table, versus in this virtual format where you might be a little more bold, a little more brave, or you can at least say something. And then maybe if you don't like the response, you can say, my technology is cutting out, I can't hear you. So I think there are some good positive things that will come out of this. But I'm curious if do you see this as an opportunity for the next gen, especially in family business? We talk about, the next gen tends to be the most tech savvy. I see this as a great opportunity for many of those individuals to really, take a greater role in how the family communicates, how the family moves forward, given that technology is going to be an even greater part of many of these enterprises, if not all.
Judy, do you want to go ahead?
Absolutely. In fact, Josh and I were just on with a family last night who was talking about precisely this topic, Dan. For them, they've got next generations who are in their 20s and 30s, and they're very happy and very comfortable working by Zoom. And they were just remarking that for them to join in on shareholder meetings, they feel like they are empowered to be more vocal. And because some of their parents and uncles and aunts are really, more deeply involved with what's going on with the business and operations and trying to help there, there's a real opportunity for them to get together as a generation and say, okay, well, what are the other questions that we want answered? How can we help organize things and make sure that the right communication is going out to the whole family during this time that's not burdensome to those who are in the business? And so I think, we see a lot of people saying, like, how can we repurpose things, or how can we make sure that we're setting up the right conversations based on the information at hand? And it's a really lovely opportunity for people to step up.
And I would just say, look for the silver lining. I mean, because a lot of, the way that we've structured meetings is often, especially for families that are dispersed, is due to travel or board directors and so on. And so you end up having these like long multi-day or whatever meetings that are not always so, feel like constructive, they're exhausting. And so you can actually, use this opportunity to sort of break it up into pieces, break it up into smaller chunks, because travel isn't a constraint, and be more inclusive. So actually, I was teaching a class at Columbia this semester. The first half of it was in person. The second half was virtual, which brought a lot of challenges because the students were going home all over the world, dealing with 12-hour time zone differences and so on. But one of the nice things that happened, which I had never done before, is that we had a session where they invited all of their family members to come and discuss what we talked about during class, so that they could actually bring some of those lessons directly to that. And that's something that would have been too difficult logistically to manage in a world of all in person. But because we were all so used to jumping on Zoom and having class that way and so on, it was super easy and really beneficial. So I would just suggest there are lots of downsides to this world of not being in person, not being able to see each other. We all know that. Try to look for what are some of the ways in which you can twist that to be an advantage for more communication, better communication, more engagement across the family business.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I might borrow that for my class. It's a great idea, Josh. Yeah. Ed Hart, you have a question?
I do, actually. Thank you, Pat, Judy, and Josh, for your expertise today. It's been great listening to you and talking with you in preparation for today as well. Question I have for you: I've read a lot of articles and seen a lot of research over the last few weeks during the COVID crisis. I'd love to get your opinions from the work you do with the families that you talk with. Do you anticipate much of a change on the succession plan of the next gens coming in based on what we're going through now? I know early on, before we were all sequestered in the first couple of weeks, when it was really the older generations that were, because of health issues or just over 65 or what have you, there was some talk about some young leaders are having to step into the corner office now because dad or mom's not around right now because they're home quarantining. Now we're all quarantining. Do you see much of an impact? And if so, what are your thoughts on what you're hearing, or just your opinions even on this?
Pat, did you want to go first, or should I?
You go ahead, Josh, and then I have a question
Sure.
for you once you answer it.
Sure. I think this is a really interesting question. I think it's having their effects pointing in multiple directions. So I think it's hard to draw a clear line of causality. I think there are some examples where because the decisions are getting a higher intensity and higher pace, it really points to the value of experience. And that's, in some ways that is causing some people that would like to step back more or had planned to step back more to step in because they need to save the business, they need to be involved. On the flip side, we are seeing that Ed, what you're talking about, not even just during that initial phase, but we are seeing some companies where the senior generation is still isolated and the current generation is back at work, and just the fact that even though they're still involved, the senior generation being present, is influencing the way that those businesses are operating. I mean, I think so. There are some instances in which I think that may accelerate some of these dynamics. So I think this is going to be something that probably depends a lot on the family and a lot on how they're experiencing the crisis and where they were in the generational transition. I do think, if nothing else, it's making people think about contingency plans. I think that's just kind of the nature of anything that brings mortality to the forefront. It's like if you have a friend that gets in a car accident, you're going to start thinking about how might this affect our business. And I think this is having a similar writ large effect. We hear more openness to conversations about what happens if. And ultimately, those are not fun conversations, but they're really important ones. And so I do think that, if nothing else, it's bringing some of those dialogues more to the fore.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, and I would just add that I really think it depends on how long this lasts. I think that right now people feel like we're coming out of it and it's been somewhat temporary. I agree with Josh that those families have made some changes. I think the tech savvy next generation is becoming very, very important and probably moved into roles earlier that they wouldn't have moved into. But I think, systemically, I don't think the business operations have changed because they're still thinking it's going to go away. I think if we have another, fall major setback and crisis again, I think then it will be time to really think about, this is the very new normal. We're never going to have the old normal again. And we're going to have to address how we run our business with a new normal. Right now, I think people are still somewhat thinking of it as temporary. And as I mentioned and Josh mentioned, I mean, family businesses are very resilient. So it's just another hurdle that they'll overcome. It's a horrendous hurdle, but they've had many of these in their life. So my question for Josh is this. You mentioned one of the important things to do right now through this time period with the pandemic is to communicate and be transparent. And interestingly enough, the Women's CEO Affinity Group, that's our topic for our next meeting, which is how much do you communicate? How transparent do you be with your employees, with your family? Not as hard of a question, maybe, unless it's multi-generational and very complex and complicated. But with your employees, it's really tough because you want to be transparent, but on the other hand, you don't want them to be fearful and you don't want to communicate everything about the profitability, or maybe you do, but around the business and the financial status of the business so that they'll continue to be encouraged and inspired.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that, family businesses just wrestle with in general. So things that are becoming, a general problem become more exacerbated during the crisis. Some are super open with, they're very transparent about everything. Some are extremely private. Only a few people know the financials of the business. And there are some trade-offs on both sides of that equation. I think one of the ways I would approach this is to sort of ask the question, transparent about what? Because I think sometimes there's you can get into this mode of saying, either we're going to tell them everything or we're going to tell them nothing. But oftentimes it doesn't require you to share everything in order to give people the answers to their questions. And so one way to think about it is if you're putting yourself in the shoes or even asking directly the employees, what are you concerned about? And for example, one of the things I think we hear, and understandably employees are wondering, is this company going to make it? Are our jobs safe? And sometimes the answer is you don't know, or sometimes the answer is it depends on whether this is a temporary crisis, or Pat, to your point, whether this is like stage one of a multi-stage kind of effort that goes on for a very long time. But oftentimes you can give them an answer that makes them answers the question without having to go too deep into what feels like private and confidential information, by saying, look, our revenue has been affected. We've been hit. You all know that. You can all see that. The fewer customers coming in the door, fewer trucks, delivery trucks going out. You all can see that. Maybe even sharing some level of percentage about that, if you don't want to give the full number. But then talk about the health of the business and say, look, we're fine. We're gonna make it. Or as long as it's within these constraints. You don't want to lie, set false expectations, but as long as it happens within this, we're gonna be just fine. Now, we've got the cash to make it through, et cetera, et cetera. You have to say how much, right? But you can sort of give them a sense of comfort and ease. And I guess that's kind of how I would start to approach it, is making sure that you're not overwhelming people. You certainly don't want to mislead them, but you want to make sure that you're answering the question in a way that allows them to go back to work and to sleep as well at night as they can.
And sometimes it's okay to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just given everything going on and the unknown, sometimes that's the most honest answer.
And I think I agree, Dan. I think in that, honesty is the place to start from. That's where trust comes from. Being transparent, being direct, being reliable. Like you will lose trust if you make false promises. And I think the only thing maybe to add is that here's what we don't know, right? It depends on this, and just to give them a little bit more of a detail rather than saying we just don't know. You could say, here are the sort of things that we're wrestling with, and if these come back, then here's one world, and if this doesn't, then another. But I agree. Sometimes the best answer is we don't know. Let's just work our best to try to make our way through it.
I think the scenario that you want to try to avoid, if you can, is the sudden surprise, right? Where you get called into a giant Zoom conference and with no indication, there's a mass firing, right? So how can you give your employees, set those expectations up front so that they're not surprised and left out in the lurch like that?
Yeah. Aaron, any questions from your side?
Yeah, so we've talked about communication within the family business. Can you all at Banyan talk a little bit about how this shift to a virtual world and primary source of communication has impacted the nature of consulting?
I would say, overall, less than I expected. This is an unprecedented time for all of us. And one of the things we didn't know was are we going to have work? Are people going to want to do the work? Because our work, tends to be these longer term change processes, which in general, you could put aside for a day or a week or a month, or maybe even a year, and sort of pick it back up. I would say that we certainly have had some, we have some family businesses that have just needed to, cut their expenses, but even more importantly, to focus their time and energy on kind of saving the business. But I would say that most of the ones that we're working with, the work has continued. It has changed. We're doing more things that are focused on crisis management, as opposed to, and putting some of the longer term things to the side, or using one as a bridge to the other. And we found that the majority of our practice does translate into this virtual world. Not everything. And I think as soon as we're able to safely get out back into the world, we see the value of in-person communication. There are certain types of conversations that really aren't very effective unless you're sitting and can get the full range of nonverbal communication. So it's not like it's 100% effective, but I would say it's better than we expected. In terms of being able to actually do the work, to focus on it. As Judy said, in some ways, the side benefit is people actually are having, because they're not traveling all the time, we oftentimes say that scheduling is the hardest part of our job. And that actually has gotten a little easier during this time period because because they're not traveling, at least some that aren't wrestling so much with childcare responsibilities, are able to actually have more of an opportunity to focus on some of these topics. So a mixed bag. Certainly has been an impact, but not all bad, and not as bad as kind of expected when this all started.
If I could just add on to that, I think the other part about family businesses is yes, they're absolutely resilient, but they also tend to have a much longer term perspective on things. And so something that we heard from a lot of family businesses was, we want to make sure that we're continuing this succession transition development process because we don't want to lose out on a year. We want to make sure that even if it's not perfect and it wasn't exactly what we could have done in person, let's keep the momentum going. So that, we don't blink and all of a sudden it's 2021 or whatnot. And then I think that just in terms of practically speaking, the shift has gone from, oftentimes when you meet in person, you can have a full day meeting or 2 half-day meetings or whatnot. When it is virtual, there's kind of a threshold where you hit where there's only so much you could stare at a screen without really needing to step back. So, more frequent, shorter virtual meetings, more frequently. I think that all those things help.
Great, thank you. And so Josh, you mentioned kind of a shift towards crisis management and things that would seem, very relevant to what we're dealing with right now and what businesses are dealing with. Have you been surprised by any shifts of, nature of requests from family businesses?
I don't think, I guess in some ways surprised, to Judy's point, that they're eager to continue. And especially for those that are seeing this as, we've seen a number of situations where they said, this is an unprecedented opportunity to help the next generation experience this. And so not really, the kinds of things we're being asked to help with are not too surprising. They're both, as Judy said, keeping the conversation going and the process going on these longer term things, but also we've had more sort of like, okay, how are we going to navigate through this particular question? We've got to make a big decision. How do we make it well? I haven't found any of those quite surprising. It's really more, as I said, on that side that people are seeing. It's so amazing. It's one of the things that makes family businesses so neat and different is that perspective of, we're going to be around, we're going to make it. So we might as well learn as much as we can from this experience, as painful as it can be.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to thank all of our panelists. I'm going to pass it back to Dan, and we really appreciate you being here with us and sharing so candidly your experiences throughout this.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, I would not want to be holding commercial real estate in an urban center right now. I think the nature of consulting and business is going to change. And yes, to your point, Josh, there's always a face-to-face element when we can get to that point. But I know I've talked with some that are in consulting type positions and feel like, maybe a big fancy office isn't needed anymore. And I can do much of this from my home. And when I need to deploy, I can deploy. So there will be some pretty significant changes coming. I'm still waiting for when Zoom creates Zoom 3D, so that like we're all sort of sitting around here, and at least it's the next sort of stage that we might get to. So we've got a few minutes left, maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and we'll see where it goes. Maybe final comments, Pat, Judy, Josh, and then we'll sign off. Pat, we'll start with you.
Okay, yeah, I would just say that while the COVID-19 has really impacted our country and certainly our population in the world, as we keep saying, family businesses go through lots of different circumstances and situations, and they are very resilient. They do plan for the long term. They see their businesses as a legacy. They want to build their business and hire people in the community and help the community. And so I'm very optimistic, and I'm typically not an optimist. I'm more of a pessimist. So I'm very optimistic about family businesses and their ability to grow. And and thrive moving forward. And I think that while some of them have suffered dramatically, and I know some, significant examples of that, they're finding different avenues to come back. And they're not, many of them are not laying off, even though they probably should. And those that are laying off are paying their employees, or they're holding their employees with the idea they will come back very quickly. So I really think, in 10 years from now, I'm hoping we'll look back and hardly remember how this affected the family businesses. And again, I think that's unique to corporate America, that has to report earnings every 3 months. And, it can change the whole business. Look at how many firms have filed for bankruptcy, firms that we never thought would be filing for bankruptcy. And that's not happening, at least to my knowledge, with family businesses. So I'm very encouraged. I'm always inspired by family businesses and the stories of family businesses. And I would ask anybody that's on this call, if you have stories of family businesses about their business as they grew, we have some on our website. We'd love to add them to our website. We'd like to talk to legislators about them, not only what they've done to their communities, but how they've built their business and what the economics are in terms of the job creation and the growth in the economy locally and nationally that their businesses have created.
Great. Thank you, Pat. Judy, Josh?
Sure. I would just like to add that, when it comes to these unprecedented, really highly uncertain times, it's really important to remember that at the heart and center of family businesses are family members and real people. And I think that we're all kind of struggling with similar things, having the mind space for certain things, struggling with things that are outside of our norms. So, where there might be some tension or flare-ups, I think if we're all able to kind of give each other the benefit of the doubt, or just be more compassionate, I think that's really great for moving forward. And I think that we've seen a lot of evidence of that, and we just encourage everyone to continue to think along those lines.
Yeah, I think I agree with Judy completely. Cut each other slack where you can. Understand this is a bumpy road, and that's the nature of it. I think I would also echo what Pat has said. I really do believe that family businesses have a competitive advantage over other kinds in this environment, because it happens to be that doing the right thing, treating your employees well, being present in your community, making long-term decisions rather than quarterly decisions is actually the smart thing in this economy. And it may not always feel that way at this moment, but if you're struggling, it'd be worthwhile to check and see how other people are doing too, because on a relative basis, you're probably doing better. And I think what we'll see is that I think Pat, people will remember the crisis, but my hope is that they remember it as a positive spur, ultimately a painful thing they went through, but that it actually led them into a next phase of an amazing trajectory of their family business. And I think that the work that you're doing now, both how you're managing through and how you're preparing for the next piece of this, will help you as those next chapters of your family business history are written.
Awesome. Thank you all. So the big takeaways for me: communication is key. Look for the silver linings, and now's a great time to make some changes for the future. Pat, Judy, and Josh, thank you all. This was very informative for those that are listening in. We will share the slides. There was some great content through there. I know Pat had a lot of content on her slides that she wasn't able to get to. Much of that is available on their website as well. So in the slides, all of the contact information and relevant web links will be in there. We have a recording of this that we'll share also after the fact. So thanks for spending the last 90 minutes with us or so. For those that are in the Family Business Alliance, we'll reconvene at 3:30 to have our owners panel. 3 amazing businesses that have survived for many generations and many years. Hussey Seating, based in Maine. Yingling Brewery, the oldest family-owned brewery in the U.S., based in Pennsylvania. And then Benko Dental, also in Pennsylvania. So a real phenomenal panel there of the businesses that have been through it and have survived and remained resilient, and how they plan to keep doing so for generations to come. So thanks all. Thanks for your help, Aaron, Hannah, Ed, and everyone else that helped bring this together. We'll see you in about an hour. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.